Okay, so we often talk about the winners, right? The crowning moments, the speeches, sometimes maybe a little trip on stage that gets talked about after a big pageant.
Yeah, the usual stuff.
But what really makes you sit up and pay attention, I think, is when someone just walks away from it all, turns their back on the whole glittering prize.
Exactly. That's not just noise, that's a signal. It's like a crack appearing in this perfect shiny surface, and suddenly you get a peek at something, well, something much more complicated underneath, maybe even a bit troubling.
And that's exactly what we saw happen recently. Milla Magee, who was Miss England 2024, literally walked out of the Miss World competition, mid-competition, in Hyderabad, India.
Yeah, not like she called in sick or something low-key. A
Yeah.
proper walkout.
Right. It felt significant. So today, we're not really digging into the gossip side, you know. We want to understand what this tells us about the currents running underneath the whole pageant world. We've been looking at this really insightful editorial. It's called When Miss England Walked Away. And it digs into what it calls the glittering lie behind these events.
That phrase, glittering lie, that really sticks, doesn't it? Because for ages, the story we've been sold is all about, beauty and empowerment. These young women finding their voice, doing good work.
Beauty with a purpose, they call it.
Right. But this incident and how the editorial unpacks it, it really suggests there's maybe a big gap between that polished story and the reality. Makes you question what's really being, well, promoted.
So let's talk more about that glittering lie.
Mm-hmm.
The editorial draws this really sharp line between the public show the perfect pictures, the speeches about world peace.
All very polished, very rehearsed.
Totally. This whole performance of the ideal woman. But behind that curtain, there's a whole other machine running. It's not just about looking good.
No, not at all. The piece mentions the saccharine speeches, the constant parade of smiles. It underlines how much of it is performance, very controlled world. And then someone like Milla Magee, who the editorial describes as having like a working moral compass. She steps off the marked path and bam. That's why it feels so potent. She basically ripped up the script.
And doing it in Hyderabad, India, you know, this big international setting, it just adds another layer. You picture this global celebration, right? Beauty from everywhere.
A meeting of cultures.
Exactly. And yet right there, something went so wrong for Miss England that walking out felt like the only option. It's quite dramatic.
Hyderabad stops being just like a nice location. It becomes the actual stage where the official story of the pageant just collided with one person's conscience. The editorial really digs into what daily life is like for contestants there. And it's a long way from just photo ops and fancy dinners.
Totally. Because you realize pretty quickly pageantry isn't just about the dress or the walk. It's this endurance test.
Yeah.
Stamina, constant self-promotion, managing your brand, activism.
It sounds exhausting.
Right. You're meant to be this perfect mix of diplomat, social media star, charity worker, and look amazing doing it.
The demands are huge. And the editorial uses this analogy. It calls it a military boot camp, but with more contouring and fewer rights.
Wow.
Yeah. And it kind of nails that intensity, the rigid schedules, the contracts that lock you in, the pressure to be on all the time.
Okay.
And you think about why someone like Magee goes in believing in beauty with a purpose, the global sisterhood.
You hope for that connection.
You do.
Yeah.
But then maybe the reality starts to feel very different, which leads to this this really quite disturbing phrase the editorial uses.
Which one?
Where it says contestants can feel like they're being farmed out like buffet items to unidentified guests.
Ugh. Yeah, that's a horrible image. It really makes you stop and think about these so-called mandatory events they mentioned happening in Hyderabad, the ones outside the main competition.
Exactly. The editorial talks about the whole red carpet treatment they got in Hyderabad, but then immediately flags it as maybe a velvet trap. There was just this relentless schedule of functions, right? Many didn't seem connected to Miss World's stated goals at all. And these weren't like, well, pop along if you fancy it. Yeah. They came with strongly worded requests from the organizers.
Implying consequences if you don't show.
Pretty much, hinting that you didn't really have a choice.
And it's those private dinner things that really sound the alarm. Not official functions, not charity events, just vague instructions. Go spend time with unnamed entertainment guests.
So vague. The editorial points out nobody knew who these people were, what the real point of the dinner was meant to be. But the unspoken message, crystal clear according to the piece. Smile, be polite, look stunning, don't ask too many questions.
That sounds less like networking and more like, something deeply uncomfortable. Performance, maybe.
Well, performance under pressure, and that term entertainment guests. It just hangs there, feeling really loaded. The editorial draws a comparison, maybe a bit dramatic, it makes you think, to the power dynamics in shows like The White Lotus.
Ah, okay. Where social events mask these huge imbalances.
Exactly. And when Milla Magee herself uses the words, saying she felt like a prostitute, I mean, that's just devastating. It speaks volumes about how powerless she must have felt.
Yeah. And we have to be clear, like the editorial is no illegal acts, no confirmed harassment was reported. That's important.
Crucial distinction.
But the coercion, the pressure on these young women attend these private things with powerful people, mostly men it seems, or maybe face career consequences, that itself is the problem.
Absolutely. It highlights how easily fuzzy language can cover up situations that feel exploitative. And that happens everywhere, not just pageants.
And doing all this while waving the flag of women's upliftment, it just feels incredibly cynical, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you seriously question the purpose behind the beauty. Like, whose purpose is it really serving in those moments? It's a reminder that sometimes the prettiest packaging can hide some pretty ugly stuff.
Which brings us back to Milla Magee just saying no, and not just quietly disappearing, but making a very public statement by walking out. No vague excuses.
Right, she owned it. And predictably, the editorial notes, the pushback came. Organizers tried to smooth it over, minimize it.
Social media piled on, I bet.
Of course.
Eh.
But her action was about speaking up in a situation where, let's be honest, a lot of women in many different fields might feel they have to stay quiet, fear of repercussions.
Totally. So her walkout basically shattered that illusion, that carefully built idea that these pageant spaces are always safe, always respectful.
It really did. And it sent this incredibly powerful signal, didn't it, to other young women everywhere, really, that you do have the right to draw a line. You could walk away from something that feels wrong, no matter how prestigious it seems.
Your well-being matters more than the opportunity.
Exactly. Your agency.
Okay, so let's shift gears slightly, because understanding why her actions caused such a stir also means looking at the money involved, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The economics are key here. Beauty pageants aren't just talent shows. They're big business. Multi-million-dollar industry. Sponsorships, marketing deals, branding.
Lots of backroom stuff, presumably.
For sure.
Yeah.
And the editorial spells it out. Contestants aren't just contestants. They're part of the business model. They're seen as assets.
Assets with expectations.
Yes, expectations that go beyond just competing. There's this unspoken or maybe sometimes spoken deal that you'll play ball with the promotional side, the networking events.
So when Magee refused, it wasn't just her taking a personal stand. It was like she was challenging the whole business model.
Directly.
Yeah.
And you saw the reaction, the scrambling, the denials, the PR spin, the editorial mentions. That's what happens when the business feels threatened.
The piece makes a really good point. The industry can probably handle a bit of superficial scandal, wardrobe malfunction, whatever.
They can spin that.
But a contestant actively saying, I refuse to be treated like a product, that's much harder for them to manage. It hits them where it hurts.
Now, there was that other argument floated, wasn't there? The whole culture clash idea. Maybe she just didn't understand Indian hospitality custom.
Yeah, that came up. But the editorial pushes back hard against that. And I think rightly so.
How so? Well, appreciating a different culture is one thing. Feeling pressured or coerced is another. Respecting local customs doesn't mean you have to silence your own feelings of discomfort or ignore potential red flags.
Good point. Hospitality shouldn't feel like an obligation you can't refuse.
Exactly. So the editorial frames it not as a cultural misunderstanding, but as a contractual failure. A failure in clear communication, a failure in getting informed consent, and crucially, a failure to provide safe ways for contestants to say no or raise concerns without fear.
Suggesting it's just cultural differences kind of lets the organizers off the hook, doesn't it?
It really does. The editorial even uses the term gaslighting, suggesting that invoking multiculturalism here could be a way to make someone doubt their own perfectly valid feelings.
Which is manipulative.
Deeply.
Yeah.
And then you look at the Miss World brand itself, this huge global name promising all these wonderful things: purpose, charity, female empowerment, world peace.
Big promises.
Huge. But their handling of Magee's exit, as the editorial points out, seems, well, lacking. No real accountability, no deep dive into what went wrong systemically.
It makes you wonder if the purpose is more about branding than, actual practice sometimes.
You have to ask. This whole incident seems to rip the curtain back on that potential gap between the image and the reality for some contestants. It highlights all these unspoken rules in the industry, doesn't it? About consent, about safety, about mental health. The implicit message often seems to be smile, nod, don't complain.
Keep the machine running smoothly.
Right. But what's the cost of that silence? The editorial asks that critical question. What damage does it do when young women feel they can't speak up? It forces the industry, or should force it, to ask hard questions. Who sets the rules for these mandatory events? Are women really briefed on how to say no without penalty? Are there proper, safe ways to complain?
Because, as the editorial puts it so well, a sash isn't armor.
And a tiara doesn't grant immunity from exploitation. Powerful lines.
They really are. So, wrapping this up, Milla Magee's decision, it feels incredibly brave in hindsight. The editorial concludes, and I think this is spot on, that her real power wasn't in potentially winning that crown.
No.
It was in choosing to walk away with her dignity, her integrity.
Absolutely. In a world where still women are often pressured just to put up with things, to endure discomfort for the sake of politeness or opportunity, her no felt kind of revolutionary.
It really did. It'll be fascinating to see if this creates lasting change. Will future contestants feel more empowered? Will the industry actually listen and adapt?
Time will tell. But it definitely leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about what really makes someone a queen. Maybe, just maybe, it's not the crown at all.
Maybe it's the courage to define your own terms, to walk away from the stage when it no longer serves your values. That feels like true empowerment.